To begin, it is important to know that Point Pleasant Park was originally named Amtukati by the Mi'kmaq people and was originally used as a Mi'kmaq gathering site. Point Pleasant Park is an Acadian forest type, containing various trees such as dominant tree species red maple and red pine, white birch, sugar maple, mountain ash, and more. On September 29, 2003, Hurricane Juan caused damage across Nova Scotia, including Point Pleasant Park, destroying about 80,000 trees. Since then, individuals involved in the Introductory Ecology Laboratory have been interested in researching secondary succession taking place across various sites at the park. Data regarding secondary succession has been collected yearly since 2004 on 6 different sites that have faced the most devastation from Hurricane Juan. Research into ecological succession positively contributes to our society as it gives us an understanding of how a disturbance, such as Hurricane Juan, influences community dynamics within natural spaces. By recognizing patterns in species growth, density changes, and overall density over time, we can better understand resilience factors that help ecosystems recover quicker. Our objectives in conducting this research and data analysis is to understand how an Acadian forest type responds to disturbances via secondary succession, and allow society to think about future forest management plans to allow for more resilience from these forest types following future disturbances. We hypothesize that as secondary succession progresses in Point Pleasant Park after Hurricane Juan, the total density, species richness, the dominant species densities, and the Shannon diversity will all significantly change over time.
Okay, so starting off the methods section with the site description. So the data in the study was collected at 6 different study sites within Point Pleasant Park, which is located at the southeastern point of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Study sites were chosen as they exhibited the most damage done by the hurricane. Our class collected the data from Site 5, which is shown in orange on the map, on October 9th of 2024. Point Pleasant Park is 75 hectares and is a mainly forested area with an average elevation of about 39 feet above sea level. It's located on the coastal region of the Atlantic, bordering the Halifax Harbor on 2 sides and the Northwest Arm on 1 side. As the study's purpose is to measure secondary succession, it's important to know what secondary succession is. So secondary succession is a change over time in the ecological or biological community following a disturbance that does not alter the substrate conditions. Prior to Hurricane Juan, Point Pleasant Park was an even-aged old-growth forest consisting mostly of red spruce and white pine. The lack of smaller juvenile trees prevented dampening of lower elevation winds, which contributed to the mass devastation and uprooting of adult hardwood species. Moving on to data collection. The study in question is a longitudinal study consisting of the collection of data from various study sites throughout the park. This took place over the course of 20 years, starting in 2004 and continuing to present day. The sites were marked off and divided into quadrants with a large measuring tape, and these sites were set up by the teaching staff at Dalhousie University in the Department of Biology. Students in Ecology 2060 were then sent into the quadrants to analyze the living trees within them. Each tree within the data collection plot with a diameter at breast height greater than 2.5 centimeters was measured using measuring tape provided by the Dalhousie University Department of Biology, and then identified and recorded. Breast height was classified to be over 4.5 feet in height, following the industry logging standard in order to be able to compare our results with results collected by other field scientists. Data analysis. The data was analyzed by Alison Schmidt using a regression analysis in RStudio. The regression analysis was chosen because our study has many different variables over several time intervals which need to be compared in order to have an understanding of the secondary succession that's taking place in Point Pleasant Park. As our hypothesis was concerned with the positive affliction of the Shannon's diversity index, which is represented by H' on the graph, this is the graph that we're going to be analyzing. The positive affliction of Shannon's diversity index is dependent on the continual increase of total density and species richness, and therefore the densities of red spruce and red maple collectively. Shannon's diversity index holds an R-squared value of 0.3352, which demonstrates that the statistical analysis does not strongly predict the possible outcome of the study. This low R-squared value arises as it's difficult to predict the events of secondary succession, with new establishing species arising as well as shifting resource availability and many other variables that contribute to this ecological process. This means that it's possible for there to be an eventual decline in the Shannon's diversity index, as the statistical data cannot predict the outcome of the study with complete certainty. The p-value, however, p equals 2.3 times 10 to the negative 8, demonstrates significant statistical data, which provides us with sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Further supporting this data, we have p-values from red spruce, which is p equals 0.0009, and red maple, which is p equals 0.0002, which also represents significant statistical data, further supporting the rejection of our null hypothesis. Okay, so how is the density of the dominant species in 2004 as well as the dominant species in 2003 changed over time? If we look at figure 2.1 on the left here, showing the density of red spruce over time in the form of a scatter plot, we can see that in Point Pleasant Park in 2004, there's a clear distinction between the density dominant hardwood species, with the average red spruce density being 3.25 and the average red maple density being 0. We can see that the dominant species for 2004 is evidently red spruce. And if we look at the data represented in figure 2.2 on the right, we can see that in Point Pleasant Park in 2003, there's a clear distinction between the dominant hardwood species, with the average red spruce density being 6.75 and the average red maple density being 35.5. This makes it evident that the red maple is a dominant species in 2023. So why does this happen? Well, in 2004, the dominant species was determined to be red spruce, which is a gymnosperm. And a gymnosperm is a group of trees with the evolutionary advantage of mass dispersal of seeds when triggered by a disruption. This advantage ensures the survival of the species following the disruption, and often renders the gymnosperms the first to be established following a disruption event. Hurricane Juan also causes changes in resource abundance. The destruction of canopy trees creates readily available ground areas that receive an abundance of light, which is favored by the red spruce. This provided red spruce with optimal growth conditions for the species, rendering it the dominant species in this year. Compared to 2003, when the red maple became the dominant species in the park. And this is because of the shade tolerance of the red maple, which allowed it to flourish in conditions of low light availability. This is relevant as the established red spruce trees had formed their canopies, reducing the amount of light available to reach the ground. However, red maple was able to persist, establish, and outcompete the red spruce. What can you predict will happen to the dominant species as the forest moves towards its climax community, and why? As the community moves through the stages of secondary succession, it's likely that the entire community will change in overall diversity and species composition or proportions. This means that it's likely that the red maple will be outcompeted or replaced as a dominant species because of the establishment of a better competing, highly tolerant hardwood species, such as hemlock, sugar maple, or balsam fir. Additionally, over time, the soil depth in the region will continue to increase as a result of the continual decomposition of fallen organic matter. This allows for further competition within the soil, favoring deep-rooting species as they are able to acquire nutrients which are inaccessible to other species. This could allow deeper rooting hardwood species to become the dominant species by outcompeting the shallower rooting hardwood species.
Looking at the figure to the right, we can see a clear increase in total density over time, with an R-squared value of 0.49 indicating that 49% of the data collected on the total diversity can be explained by time passed following Hurricane Juan. A p-value of less than 0.05 indicates that this data further supports our hypothesis that there is a significant change in total density over time. So why does this make sense? Following the disturbance, lots of biomass was lost, and therefore the total density was low. The recovery phase, called aggradation, allows for an increase in living biomass as pioneer species colonize open spaces, contributing to an increase in total density over time. Over time, these pioneer species facilitate the growth of other species, furthering allowing the total density to increase. As the forest recovers from succession and approaches its climax community, it will enhance its stability and become more resilient to disturbances. We can also predict that the total density will start to stabilize. The total density starts to stabilize as a result of competition and natural selection, favoring those who are most fit to survive within the community and those whose niches can be supported.
To determine how species richness has changed over time at the sites at Point Pleasant Park after Hurricane Juan, we measured the number of species found in the sites from 2004 to 2024. According to Figure 4, the species richness has approximately tripled over the past 20 years, and in Figure 4, the data shown has an R-squared of 0.6051, which shows a likely correlation between time and the increasing species richness. As Point Pleasant Park moves towards a climax community, we predict that species richness will first reach its maximum, then begin to decrease. According to Wyden, Falk, and Wiseland, if a community remains undisturbed for long periods, They will be dominated by a few competitively superior species, and pioneer species are driven to extinction. Eventually, when the climax community is reached, it will stabilize to a few highly competitive species and will have a lower species richness than when it was first being colonized by the pioneer species after Hurricane Juan. Point Pleasant Park's Acadian forest is likely still in the early stages of succession. According to Hammonds, there's 4 phases of forest succession, and in the first phase, stand initiation is when plants begin to establish and grow due to available sunlight and is a stage that lasts 15 to 25 years. The second phase occurs when sunlight becomes a limiting resource and excludes new plants from establishing. According to Figure 4, the species richness is continuing to increase over time, meaning new species are still able to establish. This means that Point Pleasant Park's succession is still in a stage where sunlight is not limiting and is likely still in the first stage of forest succession, especially when compared to the second stage where sunlight becomes a limiting factor. Urban parks affect forest succession by experiencing more disturbances than forests outside of cities. They can be fragmented, non-native species can be introduced easily, and overall the forests are actively managed by humans who try to control what happens within the forest. An example of this management occurred in Point Pleasant Park before Hurricane Juan. The public prevented thinning from occurring, which would have made the forest more uneven in age and more durable. By keeping the forest in its even-aged state, it made the devastation caused by Hurricane Juan worse than what it could have been. Urban forests will also end up with plenty of non-native species, likely due to proximity to urban development. Two-Light Seeing can assist Point Pleasant Park's recovery to a mature forest. By integrating both Western and Indigenous sciences, it can provide more knowledge, which we can call upon to ensure the best decisions are made in regard to the park's recovery. The forest succession of Point Pleasant Park is a community effort and requires all voices and perspectives to be heard to ensure it properly recovered.
Looking at the graph to the right, we can see a general pattern of decreasing average DBH of trees over time as the total density increases. This can suggest competition over resources in the forest community as interactions intensify, but does not necessarily mean that the competition is reducing forest productivity. We have previously mentioned that the Shannon diversity, overall species richness, and total density increases with time, suggesting that the competition may decrease individual tree growth, but it is not reducing the overall forest productivity as the forest moves further into the intermediary stages of succession.
According to Burley et al., Point Pleasant Park before Hurricane Juan was very even-aged and contained primarily long-lived species common to the Acadian forest, like red spruce, white pine, and some red maple. Since the pre-Hurricane Park contained primarily long-lived species, it was likely in a later stage of succession, where the species distribution was unevenly dominated by a handful of late successional species. As seen previously in Figure 4, there's currently high species richness throughout the sites of Point Pleasant Park, and in Figure 6, using Pelot's evenness, most points on the graph are above 0.5, meaning that there is a more even species distribution and that there is not only a few species dominating over the others found in the park. This differs greatly to the pre-Hurricane Park, likely due to the fact that post-Hurricane Point Pleasant Park is in an earlier successional stage which contains more competing colonizer species.
What information can you use to predict what species is most likely to become the dominant species in Point Pleasant Park, and what species is most likely to become the dominant species? Well, in order to predict what species will become the most dominant species as Point Pleasant Park approaches its climax community, we first need to know what species are currently present in Point Pleasant Park, the competitive capabilities and ecological characteristics of each species, and the current environment of Point Pleasant Park. After taking all these factors into account, it's my prediction that the sugar maple will become the dominant species in the park, as it's highly shade-tolerant, deep-rooting, long-living, and able to thrive in dense forests and outcompete other species in mature forests, which is what Point Pleasant Park is.
We would like to thank Dr. Allison and Max Henry Adams for answering all questions and concerns we had concerning creating this project. We would also like to thank everyone who has contributed to the ongoing research project for the last 20 years and has been involved in the Bio 2060 lab. On this slide is some of the references we had used, and on this slide is the remaining references.